From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is the story on Saturday. I'm Manveen Rana. This weekend on the podcast and across the Times, we're marking the 250th anniversary of America declaring independence. It's an epic tale of revolution, rebellion, and the making of a global superpower. But how did Britain end up fighting and losing the war that gave birth to the most powerful nation on earth? The Times history correspondent Jack Blackburn tells the story.
As Benjamin Franklin set sail from Britain in 1775, he looked back on a country he had once so admired. He had once proudly declared, "I am a Briton," and had spent the past 18 years as a happy resident of London, with a home near to the great bulwark of liberty, Parliament. Now the man who was about to become an American founding father was fleeing for his own safety, convinced that the relationship between colonies and mother country was irreparable. When he had arrived for this stint in London, Franklin would have found such an outcome inconceivable. In other such stories, the origins of the American Revolution would have taken a century to develop. The decline between Britain and America took only a decade. A brutal war was weeks away. A nation would soon be born. And it had all begun with a piece of goatskin. In the National Archives in Kew lies the fuse which helped make a superpower. Contained in one big roll of vellum is a document, the contents of which would likely prove a widely effective cure for insomnia. But the Stamp Act of 1765 can reasonably lay claim to having set the world on fire. Before the bill was laid before Parliament, the relationship between Britain and America was warm and profitable. Franklin, who was then a colonial agent for Pennsylvania working in London, said that Americans had the best temper in the world toward Great Britain, and that George III was the very best king in the world. The Stamp Act began the remarkable, swift destruction of those sentiments, even to the point of creating an entirely new country. Some may think 21st century Britain has seen disastrous fiscal policy, but nothing quite as bad as that. The Stamp Act was one of a series of measures passed to deal with a major debt crisis. The 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 had left Britain on the verge of a new imperial age, but defending global interests, including in America, had almost doubled the national debt. It was felt the colonies needed to pay their share. So it was decreed that Americans would pay to affix stamps to all sorts of paper products such as legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. Prosaic policy. But unwittingly, it removed the keystone from the transatlantic bridge. Tax rises have rarely been popular, but in 18th century America, they were unholy. The colonies sent all their trade through Britain, through which the government claimed much revenue, but no direct taxes were paid. This was a marker of America's long-standing autonomy. The stamps, therefore, were not just an inconvenience, but an assault on America's liberty. There were protests on American streets, royal officials had their homes ransacked, and costly non-importation agreements were passed by colonial legislatures. Franklin, a former printer, a scientist, and a man of letters, pleaded the colony's case to peers and MPs in Westminster, many of whom had had no inkling as to how poorly the legislation would go down. Franklin said that Britain's esteem in America was now very much altered, and that respect for Parliament as a great bulwark of liberty was very much lessened. Asked if America would ever submit to the Stamp Act, Franklin said, "No, never, unless compelled by force of arms." Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, and the story might have ended there, but the British government now had a point to prove. It passed the Declaratory Act, which made clear that Parliament had the same authority in America as it did in Britain. As far as they were concerned, the principle of parliamentary authority was the cornerstone of the British Constitution, and it needed defending. Meanwhile, revenue still needed to be drummed up. So it was not long before these twin objectives reopened the wounds in the Anglo-American relationship. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, introduced a series of acts which levied taxes and introduced regulations in the colonies, most of which would again be repealed after further backlashes. But they led to boycotts and unrest, especially in Boston, which was fast becoming the centre of revolutionary feeling. In 1768, Britain sent troops to the city, and at this news, Franklin's worry turned to dismay. He wrote that bringing insolent soldiers next to people who feel oppressed seemed to be like setting up a smith's forge in a magazine of gunpowder. He was most prescient. On March the 5th, 1770, an angry crowd confronted and harassed a group of 9 soldiers who opened fire on up to 400 people, killing 5. In years to come, John Adams, later the second US president, would say that the foundation of independence was laid in the Boston Massacre. It would be in Boston that the colonies started to coordinate their actions through committees of correspondence. Across the eastern seaboard, local militias were reorganised. A new government in Britain in 1770, led by Lord North, attempted a policy of conciliation, but maintained the British inability to anticipate how tensions might be inflamed. Then again, who would suspect terrible anger could be caused by tea? The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to shore up the indebted East India Company, and the government didn't consider that it would have any serious implications for America. They were quite wrong. The granting of a monopoly to the East India Company undercut American merchants, who were still paying hated Townshend duties. Naturally, it was Boston where tensions came to a head on December the 16th, 1773, when locals boarded 3 ships and poured their tea cargoes into the harbour. It would be many decades before this was christened as the Boston Tea Party. Lord North and George III were incensed by this news. Again, it was viewed as vital that parliamentary authority be upheld, and America's cries of no taxation without representation fell on deaf ears. A series of punitive measures, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, were introduced against Massachusetts, which interfered with the colony's government and justice system, and forced colonists to give quarter to British troops. Franklin said, "We never had since we were a people so few friends in Britain." He was still hoping and working for a reconciliation in Westminster, but his own relationship with the mother country was nearing breaking point. Franklin had come into possession of a series of letters which showed that Thomas Hutchinson, His Majesty's governor in Massachusetts, was sending extremely disparaging reports of colonial life back to London. Franklin thought that more honest and everyday depictions of colonial life were being represented to the Crown, explained Dr. Megan King of Benjamin Franklin House, the museum based in Franklin's London home. But now that he sees that this was how colonists were being portrayed to George III, It was a major turning point for him. Franklin's role in the eventual publication of these letters saw him accused of treason. He fled the country in March 1775 before a warrant could be issued for his arrest. By the time Franklin arrived at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the war had already begun. British troops on their way to a munitions store in Concord had been confronted by local militia at nearby Lexington. No one knows who first pulled the trigger, but they were responsible for the famous shot heard round the world. The battles of Lexington and Concord started the war, and American militia, a force of non-uniformed part-timers, defeated British regulars. Within weeks, further bad tidings followed for the British. Fort Ticonderoga had fallen, the American Continental Congress had formed an army, and they were bearing down on the King's troops in Boston. In the face of this, one might assume Britain to be fully behind a military response. But the nation was split on the American question, which had dominated politics in the 1770s. The opposition sympathised with the American argument that their liberty was being oppressed by a parliament they had no hand in electing. Rival petitions attracted thousands of signatures, but the key figure of King George III was clearly on one side of the argument. The king viewed the troublemakers in America as nothing less than traitors, and he wanted them put down. He was frustrated with his Prime Minister, Lord North, who took a cautious approach. When the PM received word of a costly victory at Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, he privately confessed that he did not think a military conquest of the colonies was possible. His nearest and dearest agreed. The Bodleian Libraries hold the family's archives, which show that North's half-brother, Brownlow, a bishop in the Lords, wrote to their father of fears that it was now too late, the Americans too strong, and that the only way to bring about union was to repeal all the acts that they complain of. Nevertheless, the direction of the government was set. Parliamentary authority must not be overcome by violence. There was a forlorn effort from the colonies, the Olive Branch Petition, which was sent to George III, but he refused to read it. Instead, a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition was issued by the king on August 23, 1775. Then, in October, George III made Britain's position abundantly clear. "I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy," he told Parliament, but he would not give up so many colonies which had been planted with great industry. He announced a massive increase of forces, and they were badly needed. The troops in Boston were running short of supplies, while the governor of Virginia, the Earl of Dunmore, had been so desperate for troops that he had issued a proclamation promising enslaved people their freedom in exchange for military service. As many as 2,000 fled to enlist with the British. The colonies were now at war with their own sovereign, and, faced with undermanned British forces, they were able to deliver chastening defeats on the king's men. In Boston, after a daring overnight manoeuvre by the Continental Army's General George Washington, where he established a commanding artillery position over the city at Dorchester Heights, the British were forced to flee Boston. It was a massive propaganda coup for the Americans, but it was still not clear exactly what they were fighting to achieve. However, an idea was emerging. The philosopher Thomas Paine had written a blockbuster pamphlet called Common Sense, which was taking an idea which had hitherto been on the political fringes and was turning it into the mainstream solution: independence. The concept became a sensation. Proportional to population, America has never seen a bigger bestseller than Paine's, though support for independence was by no means unanimous. Certainly for the more wealthy southern colonies, particularly people who had much more transatlantic business interests, they were much more reluctant to declare independence, said Dr. Graham Moore, researcher at the National Archives and curator of their exhibition, America's Independence Story. Even by July 1776, these people are still being brought round. The Declaration of Independence, chiefly drafted by Thomas Jefferson with Franklin as one of a number of co-authors, is a masterpiece of political philosophy and propaganda. Language about self-evident truths remains inspiring 250 years on, but its chief aim was as a rallying cry for rebels. Whereas previous American tracts had attacked Parliament, the Declaration turned its fire on the king, accusing him of repeated injuries and usurpations and absolute tyranny over these states. One gobsmacking section where Jefferson, a notorious slave owner, attempted to blame the slave trade entirely on George III, was cut. The Declaration made George III a pantomime villain for Americans, a role he still plays today in shows like Hamilton. In New York, after the Declaration was read, the equestrian statue of the king was torn down. The Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776, and the Declaration was issued 2 days later, with 200 copies printed by a John Dunlap. Governors and other sources sent these back home. In fact, so many were returned to Britain that today the National Archives in Kew boasts the largest collection of these original copies in the world. They've even loaned one back to Philadelphia for this year's celebrations. In Britain, the Declaration was not viewed as a seminal moment. Newspapers either dismissed it or ignored it entirely. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham thought the opinions of modern Americans on government to be ridiculous. There is no indication that George III ever actually read it. For Franklin, the break was painful. It was personal for him to an extent, said King. He fancied himself such a true Anglo-American. While he was in London, he was even tracing his English ancestry because he truly valued that link. The war would also be personal for Franklin, for it was not just a rebellion, but also a civil war. His son William, the colonial governor of New Jersey, would be one of the most staunch loyalists Britain had in the war. The conflict was also one of history's greatest gambles. The signatories of the Declaration were now self-declared enemies of one of the world's superpowers. When it was signed, the president of the Continental Congress, John Hancock, told his fellows, "We must all hang together." Franklin replied, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together. Or most assuredly, we will all hang separately." He was not wrong, because the day the Continental Congress voted for American independence, the British Armada arrived. Britain expected to win the war. Britain very nearly did win the war. Yet on that day, in 1776, was it a cause the British had already lost?
That was the Times history correspondent Jack Blackburn, and you can read his piece on how Britain drove America to independence at thetimes.com. And to mark the 250th anniversary, the Times has also set up a spin-the-wheel search of our archives to bring up stories from across the paper's long history of reporting on America, which has spanned much of those 250 years. Do give it a go. The producer and sound designer today was Dave Creasy. The executive producers were Sophie McNulty and Edward Drummond. We'll be back tomorrow with a look at America through the eyes of its first people. What does it mean to be Native American in 2026? Do join us then.